Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. So today, we are going to continue our discussion of Weber, and specifically his piece, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. But today, we're going to get into Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 does make a little bit more sense than the previous stuff that we read, so hopefully this will bring it all together. So, let's get started. So Chapter 2 is called The Spirit of Capitalism. And the first thing that Weber does is start to address what that might even mean. In the title of this study is used the somewhat pretentious phrase, the spirit of capitalism. I love this. He's admitting it's pretentious, but in a really passive way, also someone else used the phrase. What is to be understood by it? The attempt to give anything like a definition of it brings out certain difficulties, which are in the very nature of this type of investigation. So basically, this chapter is going to make a big circle. He's starting with the idea that we don't have a definition of the spirit of capitalism. And he's basically admitting that up front. And what we'll do over the course of this chapter is kind of go on a journey to find out what the spirit of capitalism might be. Because what he says next is very important. That basically, he's trying to find a definition and he isn't there yet. So he says, well, maybe it's a complex of elements associated in historical reality, which we unite into a conceptual whole from the standpoint of their cultural significance. Which, sure, everything is that. That's just a definition of, things. Everything we study in sociology is very specifically a complex of elements associated with their cultural significance, so this is kind of a weak sauce definition. So this is where he lands. Thus, at the final and definitive concept cannot stand at the beginning of the investigation, but must come at the end. And this is true. This is how we do science. We start with a question, and then we kind of work our way there. So basically, he's saying, I know that this is something that exists, but the problem is I don't have a clear definition, so we're just gonna have to go on this little journey. We're just gonna have to get there, and hopefully at the end, we will have a definition. So it's a little bit frustrating because why name your book this if you don't know what it is? But at least he's admitting that when we do science, sometimes we end up with results we didn't quite expect, and sometimes we don't know what the answer is until we get there. So at least he's being honest. So as part of the effort to finding out what the spirit of capitalism might be, he checks in with some other people. Very specifically, Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin had a lot to say about money. Not all of it made sense, but whatever. So basically, these are the quotes that he listed for Benjamin Franklin, and I want you to listen carefully and see if you see a theme emerging. Remember that time is money. Remember that credit is money. Remember that money is of the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. The good paymaster is the lord of another man's purse, and the most trifling actions that affect a man's credit are to be regarded. So Benjamin Franklin was totally a capitalist, and he was very interested in making more money and doing so in rational ways, but he was also very clearly tying your ability to make money to some other stuff. So what Weber says is that this is just hugely utilitarian. Now, all Franklin's moral attitudes are colored with utilitarianism. Honesty is useful because it assures credit. So are punctuality, industry, frugality, and that is the reason they are virtues. So basically, Weber is looking at what Franklin is saying, and he's thinking, he's not really talking about this in a philosophical sense, and he's not really talking about this in a scientific sense. He's talking about money, and especially about the attitudes and behaviors that generate money, in a super utilitarian sense. So essentially, Franklin is not even arguing that punctuality and industry and frugality are good. He's arguing that punctuality and industry and frugality can help you make money. And so Weber is looking at this, and he's thinking to himself, oh, I see. This isn't about math. This isn't about being reasonable. This is about being the kind of person who can make money. So he really starts to take this further, and these next quotes are pretty important. So basically he says, truly, what is here preached, by Franklin, is not simply a means of making one's way in the world, but a peculiar ethic. The infraction of the rules is treated not as foolishness, but as forgetfulness of duty. So again, we're no longer talking about ethics for the sake of ethics. We're talking about ethics for the sake of money. It goes further. That is the essence of the matter. It is not mere business astuteness. That sort of thing is common enough. It is an ethos. This is the quality that interests us. So again, Weber is looking at this and saying, hey, this is different. This is not something we've seen before. This is basically tying virtue to wealth. And how is this happening? Keeps going. Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose in life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as the means for the satisfaction of his material needs. So essentially he's saying we're undergoing this shift. And it's no longer about making enough money to survive or making enough money to take care of your family. It's just about making money. Money, more money, maybe even some more money than that. And so what Weber ultimately comes down with is that this is a little weird. He's looking at this and he's thinking like, nobody else ever thought about money like this, right? And he says it is foreign to all peoples not under capitalistic influence. So he's saying, you know what? Yeah, this is a little weird. We have not seen this before. It's basically a foreign concept to anybody who wasn't raised with it. And that's why we're going to study it, because it's weird. Again, a foundational part of sociology. So now Weber is like, yeah, okay, but how did we get here? Where did they get these ideas? If these are brand new ideas, if these are foreign ideas, where did they come from? So he starts with maybe they came from the Bible. There's this one part in the Bible from Proverbs that says, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings." So you could argue that a person who is diligent at business is a good business person, is someone who will stand before the Lord, basically, is someone who should be valued. But then he's like, well, maybe it's this idea of a divine calling. So a divine calling is not something we talk about much anymore, but it used to be a very, very important thing. It used to be a huge part of how you pick what you're going to do for the rest of your life. So this is how he defines that. The earning of money within the modern economic order is, so long as it is done legally, the result and expression of virtue and proficiency in a calling. One's duty in a calling is what most characteristic of social ethic of capital culture, and is in a sense the fundamental basis of it. So he's saying, well, maybe it is tied to the Bible, but the idea is that if you are working in your calling and the job that God told you to do, that it's okay to make money that way. So basically, this is a little complicated, but this is kind of the short version of that. This idea that God gave you a calling. And if you do your calling and you make money, that is okay, because by doing your calling, you're proving your love for God. And so ultimately, if you make money doing your calling, you are also proving your love to God. It's complicated, but it's basically this: your calling, which is given to you by God, is a way for you to make money, which is also given to you by God, as a way to prove how much you love God. And it is convoluted, but it's important to kind of step back and remember that he's talking primarily about Calvinists. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Calvinists last week, but as a quick refresher, Calvinists are Christians and they are Protestants, but they are also a branch of Protestants. So the whole church just keeps branching and branching and branching, but the thing that's particular to Calvinists is that they are believers in predestination. So all Calvinists believe that you have a fate that is already predetermined, that the God has essentially decided who's going to go to heaven and who's not, and that there's nothing you can do about it. You can live your life in such a way that calls glory to God, and you can live your life in such a way that indicates that God likes you, but ultimately your fate is not in your hands. So for Calvinists, everything they do, they talk about having been determined by God. Was it really? That's a matter for the Calvinists to decide, right? But if you believe that God chose a job for you, and if you believe that doing well at that job is okay by God, then you can believe that having money is okay by God. And that's tricky, right? Because if you have read the Christian Bible, you're probably familiar with the idea that that doesn't really exist in there. So for the Calvinists, they had to essentially think of a way to make working hard and making money the same thing as being a good Christian. And it gets a little bit complicated. So this next part is kind of crucial, although these quotes are a little complicated. But basically Weber is trying to argue that this is a hard sell. that convincing people that they have to work hard all the time in order to be accepted and in order to be loved by God is kind of a hard sell, because being more leisurely is way easier. So he starts to talk about how the idea of capitalism and the idea of the work ethic has to be a central part of society. We have to convince people that this is true. So here's how he starts. A conscious acceptance of these ethical maxims on the part of the individuals, entrepreneurs, or laborers in modern capitalistic enterprises is a condition of the further existence of present-day capitalism. So basically, everyone who is involved must consciously accept these maxims. We have to wake up and think to ourselves, it's time to get that bread. And we have to think it every day, and we have to have no days off. He then says that we have to start accepting this basically from the minute we're born. The capitalistic economy of the present day is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. So again, this isn't optional. You are born into this capitalistic system. You will start going to work as a small baby. You will continue going to work until you die, but it has to look like this is your only option. It has to look unalterable. The last part is that he says we have to believe that our participation is mandatory. Thus, the capitalism of today, which has come to dominate economic life, educates and selects the economic subjects which it needs through a process of economic survival of the fittest. So essentially, if you don't participate in capitalism, you're kind of screwed. You have to participate. It's survival of the fittest. And those people who cannot participate, who cannot work, for instance, are screwed. So he's saying that it demands that you participate. It demands that you start participating when you're little. And if you cannot participate, too bad for you. So this is pretty dark, but this is also a pretty compelling argument. So Weber does pause to notice that this is kind of weird, and frankly, it wasn't popular at the time. This is a hard thing to get people to believe and to get them to dedicate their entire lives to. The spirit of capitalism, in the sense in which we are using the term, had to fight its way to supremacy against a whole world of hostile forces. And again, this might kind of speak to you, because the capitalism that he's describing is exhausting. So to convince people that that was the only way to do things had to be a whole process. In previous times, it would have been described as the lowest sort of avarice and as an attitude entirely lacking in self-respect. Pretty mean, right? But it's true. This idea that to work yourself to the bone, to drive yourself to the grave, is kind of tacky. We don't like this. This isn't how everybody wants to live. Other cultures still look at capitalism like it's kind of a dumb choice. He goes on to say that we didn't invent the idea of acquisition, the idea of being rich. At all periods of history, wherever it was possible, there has been ruthless acquisition, bound to no ethical norms whatsoever. So the idea of acquisition isn't a new thing. It's just that capitalism is, and this idea of working yourself to the bone is. So he says that even though we used to not think this was great, things are about to change. The most important opponent with which the spirit of capitalism has had to struggle was that type of attitude and reaction to new situations, which we may designate as traditionalism. So he's going to talk more about traditionalism later, but the idea here is basically people didn't want to switch to this new version of capitalism. They didn't want to go work in the factory 7 days a week. They wanted to do some work and then chill. So things had to change for them to buy into this capitalistic system. And what we're going to talk about next is how they changed. So one of the problems with acquiring wealth is that the best way to do it is to make other people do it. Essentially, the best way to make a bunch of money easily is to make other people do the work. So this makes sense, and the people at the top were ready. They had the capitalistic spirit. But what that meant was that they had to sell the capitalist spirit to the people on down the line. So the question becomes, how do we get everybody at every level of the company to work as hard as possible? And specifically, how do we get the people at the lowest levels of the company to work as hard as possible, but as cheaply as possible? So Weber phrased it like this: The goal is to secure the greatest possible amount of work from his men. So we're going to go through a couple of options in terms of ways to get the greatest possible work out of people, but while still paying them the least. So the first one is called piece rates. And basically this means that you get paid per piece of work you do. So for instance, if you were mowing lawns, you would get paid per acre, not per hour. So the expectation here is that people will work as much as possible to make as much money as possible. They will mow as many lawns as they can get to that day. The reality is that people don't do that. Is that people pretty much want as much money as they had before, and they will do as much work as it takes to get that money and no more. So here's what Weber has to say about it. The opportunity of earning more was less attractive than that of working less. Pretty sensible, and honestly, I get it. But he was really surprised. He didn't think it would turn out this way. He did not ask, how much can I earn in a day if I do as much work as possible? But how much must I work in order to earn the wage which I earned beforehand, and which takes care of my traditional needs? So they thought that perhaps paying by piece of work done would work, but instead what ended up happening was that people did as much work as they had to, and then just stopped working. Which I can understand. The second option was just lowering the wages. Low wages and high profits seem, even today, to a superficial observer, to stand in correlation. Everything which is paid out in wages seems to involve a corresponding reduction of profits. And again, this makes sense. If you raise wages, profits go down, and vice versa. A time-honored tradition is to cut wages in order to make higher profits. But even Weber sees a problem with this. He says that number one, low-wage workers are hungry and sick workers. This may sound familiar. Adam Smith said this too. The efficiency of labor decreases with a wage which is physiologically insufficient. If you do not pay your workers enough to survive, they won't survive. You should pay them enough to have a home, food, healthcare, that sort of thing. The second problem, some jobs require skilled workers, and they aren't cheap. So you can't lower the wages of everybody, because eventually the people who have skills aren't going to work for you because they know that those skills have value and they want to get paid for it. The third problem is that some jobs require a developed sense of responsibility, and you only get that with a person who is secure in their job. So I think this meme does kind of explain it, this idea that there might be a problem at work, but you don't get paid enough to care. You've probably heard people say that something is above their pay grade, or they don't get paid enough to care about this. And that's true too. If you're, again, only getting paid minimum wage, you might put in minimum effort. So Weber acknowledges that just lowering wages might not give you the results you're looking for, because it might drive away the skilled workers, it might make your workers too hungry and sick to do good work, and it might make them just not care about the job, period. So basically, this is also not a good idea. He lands on the only real solution, which is basically convincing people that working hard is good outside of getting paid. Labor must, on the contrary, be performed as if it were an absolute end in itself, a calling. But such an attitude is by no means a product of nature. It cannot be evoked by low wages or high ones alone, but can only be the product of a long and arduous process of education. So he says the best way to get people to work hard for probably not very much money is to tell them that they have to, and that God wants them to, and that everybody does it, and that by working hard you're a good person, and other things that you've probably heard before. So basically, this is the way, he says, to convince people to believe in capitalism. You have to start when they're young and convince them that it's the best thing in the world, and that that's how we get people to have this work ethic, by telling them from a young age that it's good. Complicated, huh? But don't worry, we'll get more into it. So the next question becomes, okay, but why do we have to talk them into it? What's stopping people from just doing this on their own? Like, what's stopping people from just working all day, working their hands to the bone? And Weber says, traditionalism. So this is the definition that he gives it. A man does not, by nature, wish to earn more and more money, but simply to live as he is accustomed to live. and to earn as much as is necessary for that purpose. So he is saying that it's actually against human nature to want to work and work and work and earn and earn and earn. He is saying that human nature prefers just to kind of chill, to work as hard as you need to live in the way to which you are accustomed. Or as Grumpy Cat says, wasn't working today enough? Like, didn't I do enough? And so to convince people that no, you've never done enough, you really have to bring a new kind of thought to mind, and that's capitalism. However, you have to kind of overcome a hurdle. And one hurdle that you have to overcome is that often people are kind of content, just chilling, just living their traditional lives. Earnings were moderate, enough to lead a respectable life, and in good times put away a little. A long daily visit to the tavern with plenty to drink and a congenial circle of friends made life comfortable and leisurely. And frankly, that does sound great, doesn't it? I would love to have a comfortable, leisurely life where every day I go to the pub and hang out with my friends and just talk about things. Honestly, I feel like he's selling this way of life a lot better than he's selling capitalism. But still, we know that when people do something like this, we do tend to sort of frown at them. We think that people who have comfortable, easy lives, who aren't overachieving, are somehow failing. And that is because we were raised in capitalism. So even though to some of us, maybe this life looks a little bit better, to some of us, this life looks like lazy people. And that's the capitalist ethic. So he goes on to say that for some people, working really, really hard all of the time just kind of feels like a waste of time. They do this sort of cost-benefit analysis, and they're like, why would you hunt 5 deer if you can only even eat 2 deer? Why would you work 80 hours if you can get by totally fine on 40 hours? An easier way to think about this might be this idea of how hard should you work on your final exam if you just want to get a B. I've seen a lot of people do this idea of what do I need on my final to get X grade? And I'm like, I don't know, you do the math. But this is a pretty common thought, this idea of only working as hard as you have to get the result you really want. So Weber is acknowledging that we have to overcome these kinds of thoughts in order to make the capitalistic ethic work. So how did we get from traditionalism to capitalism? Weber argues big social changes. He says now, at some time, this leisureliness was suddenly destroyed. And he says that basically a new kind of person started showing up, a new kind of entrepreneur, a new kind of capitalist. And that this kind of person changed the way that we do everything. These sort of young, clever, entrepreneurial people would start showing up and changing lines of distribution, or changing shops, or changing the way that we sold the merchandise, period. And that basically the changes that they sowed turned into even bigger changes. So first he describes the kind of person, the kind of spirit that is required. And what is most important in this connection, it was not generally such cases a stream of new money invested in the industry which brought about this revolution, but the new spirit. The spirit of modern capitalism had set to work. So he's saying that these changes weren't necessarily inspired by specific people, they were inspired by a specific spirit. The idea that the hustlers need to wake up and get this bread, again, no days off. So what did this do? Were people pleased with this? Again, no. People didn't love this change. People thought it was kind of tacky, especially the people who had previously been wealthy. They kind of looked at this entrepreneurial spirit, this capitalist ethic, and they were like, oh, no, that sounds terrible and kind of gross. Its entry on the scene was not generally peaceful. Again, I'm sure you can imagine, people do hate change. So he said, basically it required a new kind of person, a different kind of human. Men who had grown up in the hard school of life, calculating and daring at the same time, above all temperate and reliable, shrewd and completely devoted to their business, with strictly bourgeois opinions and principles. So no more of the titled lords who had just inherited this wealth and were just sort of continuing their family lineage. Now, we're starting to see a new spirit, a new person, this sort of scrappy individual, this started from the bottom, now we're here sort of thing. So he's saying that the kind of person who is successful is someone who is shrewd, someone who did grow up with some struggles. Jay-Z, perhaps. So then he goes on to say that they must have some sort of motivation, that essentially just earning and earning and earning couldn't possibly be enough on its own. If you ask them what is the meaning of their restless activity, why they are never satisfied with what they have, thus appearing so senseless to any purely worldly view of life, they would perhaps give the answer, if they knew of any at all, to provide for my children and grandchildren. And this is true. If you ask people, like, why do you go to work? Very often they will say, like, because I have all these mouths to feed. Especially if you ask people who don't even like their jobs that much. So this idea of maybe their motivation is to take care of their children, pretty sensible. People do like to say that kind of thing. But Weber thinks this is not the whole story. But more often, and since that motive is not peculiar to them, but what was just as effective for the traditionalist, more correctly simply, that business, with its continuous work, has become a necessary part of our lives. So he's saying that this idea that you just want to provide for your children and their children and their children isn't new, and frankly that isn't enough to cut it. That isn't enough to explain this big change. He thinks it's different. He thinks that the reality is that work has become a necessary part of our lives. And again, this is true. You can't just not work. You know, like you can't survive in the capitalist system by just not working. So his argument is that we had to become obsessed with work. It had to become a necessary part of our lives. It had to become a means to survival. But even more than that, it had to become something that we cared about. So this is how he said it. Business, with its continuous work, has become a necessary part of their lives. Man exists for the sake of his business instead of the reverse. You've heard this before, but you may be more familiar with the words of our great poet Snoop Dogg, mind on my money and my money on my mind. That basically, we had to change the whole way we thought about money. We had to change the whole way we thought about ourselves. And so we had to switch from doing as much work as we had to survive to constantly having our mind on our money and our money on our mind. And that was the big social switch that Weber's talking about. Then Weber makes it personal. And by personal, I mean he talks about America. When the imagination of a whole people has once been turned toward purely quantitative bigness, as in the United States, this romanticism of numbers exercises an irresistible appeal to the poets among businessmen. So essentially he's saying this ignited a spark in some people, and specifically in American people, which is true. This is something that we love in America, acquisition, quantitative bigness. So he's saying that it wasn't enough to convince a couple people, you had to convince everybody. This is another sort of rephrasing of that. That anyone should be able to make it the sole purpose of his life work, to sink into the grave weighed down with a great material load of money and goods, seems to him explicable only as the product of a perverse instinct, the ares sacra fames. So basically he's saying, it's weird though, right? We haven't seen this idea before, that you need to go to the grave weighed down by all of your wealth. That just accumulating wealth is the same thing as being good. He's saying usually we think of this as actually kind of a curse. That's what this part means, the accursed need for gold. So how do we switch from it being a curse to being a blessing? So he says we have to make it necessary. The capitalistic system so needs this devotion to the calling of making money. It is an attitude toward material goods which is so well suited to that system, so intimately bound up with the conditions of survival, that there can no longer be any question of a necessary connection to that acquisitive manner of life. So again, you have to tell everybody that they have to. You have to make capitalism at the very root of their little American souls. So that even though it kind of sucks, and it's kind of tacky, and it's not a great way to live, we have to believe that it's necessary. This is sort of the summation of that part. Whosoever does not adapt his manner of life to the conditions of capitalistic success must go under, or at least cannot rise. And again, true. in the capitalist system, if you do not adapt to this, if you do not buy into the idea that to acquire wealth is the same thing as being good, or to acquire wealth is the same thing as staying alive, then you will not rise. And you knew this on some level because you've been told this over and over, probably in your education, but definitely by the media. So basically, we had to convince people that this was true, that this was central to our lived experience, or else nobody would do it. So this is what he's talking about. This is the capitalistic ethic. This idea that we believe at the heart of our being that working hard and earning money is not only godly and good, it's necessary, and we can't live without it. So one question you may have, which is a totally reasonable question, is, okay, but how did they reconcile this with religion, especially with Christianity? Like, these two things don't really mesh. So here's what Weber says. For that conception of money-making as an end to itself, to which people were bound as a calling, was contrary to the ethical feelings of whole epochs. It is hardly necessary to prove. A little convoluted, but what he's basically saying is, yeah, we know. This is opposite to what we had been telling you. So he goes on to sort of deal with some things that have been happening in the Bible to try to explain how we made this connection. So he says that basically Christianity does not advocate for wealth. Basically, in the New Testament, Jesus especially is pretty clear about money not being a necessary part of living a good life or of living a godly life. He quotes a few things, and there are some amazing examples, but basically this happens all throughout the Christian Bible. This idea that blessed are those who weep now, if you love money, you'll never be satisfied, be satisfied with what you have, you cannot serve both God and money. There's a lot of these in the Bible. This idea that a focus on wealth is the opposite of a focus on God. My personal favorite, which I've really never gotten over, is the one about the camel. I'll say it again, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. As a child, I was very literal, and I spent a lot of time worrying about this. I was very confused, like, why don't they just breed smaller camels, or like maybe make a bigger needle? And it turns out it's a metaphor, like a lot of other stuff in the Bible. But I was very concerned, so I just wanted to make sure that other people knew it's just a metaphor. So now Weber has to talk about how we separated the economy from the church. Because they used to be kind of connected. The Catholic Church controlled the economy for centuries. And basically, the Catholic Church had tied itself to money via a series of, like, paying to get in God's favor. So you could buy indulgences, which is basically like if you sinned, you would give the church money, or you could buy people's way into heaven, or you could buy special prayers. And he was saying that even people who didn't necessarily believe in the Catholic Church or believe in God took part in this. Even skeptics and people indifferent to the church often reconciled themselves with it by gifts, because it was a sort of insurance against the uncertainties of what might come after death. So he says that this combination of the church and money is not necessarily new, but it's not something we want anymore. He says, in fact, it no longer needs the support of any religious forces, and feels the attempts of religion to influence economic life to be as much an unjustified interference as its regulation by the state. So again, we used to combine money and church, but we're not going to do that anymore. He says we're also not going to combine money and government, which is kind of interesting, and that gets convoluted, but his point here is that we're going to try to separate those two things. So now Weber's like, well, what had to change for this to happen? What had to change for us to become accepting of the idea that being rich is being good? What was the background of ideas which could account for the sort of activity apparently directed toward profit alone, as a calling toward which the individual feels himself to have an ethical obligation? So if we are convinced that we have an obligation to be rich, what changed in the background to make that happen? And you'll never guess, that's right, the Industrial Revolution. You'll get tired of hearing me say this, but sorry, that's what this class is about. So basically, we had to have all these big picture changes. We had to move to the city, we had to work in the factory, we had to leave the home to work, we had to become more rational, we had to get rid of our family ties, we had to start to see working as good money, as good endless work, as good, we had to buy into a brand new system. And the root of this, the root of Weber, is coming up now. It's this next slide. We had to take all the stuff that we thought was good about religious people and just transfer those qualities to rich people. That's the real idea with Weber here, is that we already liked religious people. We already liked people who we thought were going to heaven. We liked these things about them. We liked hard work. We liked success. We liked the fact that they had money and capital. We liked the fact that they were already popular and beloved. So we took all the stuff that was great about the best and purest and most religious people, especially under Calvinism, and we switched it to being all the stuff that is great about rich people. So now, instead of believing that the good Christian is good because they work hard and God loves them, we believe that the wealthy person is good because they work hard and God loves them. So basically we switched it from religious people are good to rich people are good. And it took this whole big social change. It took us believing that hard work is the same thing as being good. It took us believing that hard work is rewarded by money. It took us believing that we didn't really need God to be part of it anymore. We basically had to switch from being obsessed with God to being obsessed with money. One of my students last semester made me this very beautiful meme that basically, instead of looking at religion, all of the Protestants turned their eyes toward capitalism. So basically it developed this like fervor for getting rich, especially in America. This took off huge in America. So now we believe, essentially, that the best possible people are not the most religious people, they're the richest people. Hopefully this is making sense, because this is essentially where we are today. This idea that all of our problems can be solved with money, all of our, social issues can be solved with money, that people with money are the happiest, and they of course tell us all the time that money doesn't buy happiness, but they don't act that way, do they? So the thing that we're going to talk about all week in class is this idea that money equals goodness, that rich equals good, and that we're no longer concerned with the ethical or religious parts of that. So, hopefully that made more sense. Hopefully Weber Chapter 2 brought it all home, and we'll be ready to discuss the capitalist ethic, the Protestant ethic, and the way that that's shaped America and turned us into the capitalists that we are today. So, as always, if you have any questions, send me an email, and I'll see you soon.